Hello, HWRA Lifestyle family. It is with great pleasure that I introduce you to Brian Deere. He wrote the book, The Doctor Who Fooled the World. And here's a book, and we're going to put it on our website. Now, this book is about the problems, the vaccination fears regarding measles and autism. Now, I believe this book is written so well that it should be a Netflix movie. He's a tremendous writer, and he takes you through this controversy about the falsehood of vaccination and measles. Uh, Brian, please introduce yourself to our audience, and so we can get started with this interview, which I'm so excited about.
Okay, I'm Brian Deere. I live in London and work in London, where I've been an investigative reporter for more years than I remember for the Sunday Times London. And I am the author of the book, The Doctor Who Fooled the World, which tells the story that I hope some of you will want to take a look into.
Okay, like I said, it should be a Netflix movie because it's written so well. Even though it has a lot of scientific information, you detail Andrew Wakefield, who was or is the doctor. Explain who Andrew Wakefield is and his ability to fool the world.
Well, the beginning with Andrew Wakefield, I suppose, would be when he published a research paper in the Lancet Medical Journal way back in 1998, where he claimed to have found a link between the MMR children's vaccine, which is the most commonly used vaccine in the world, and autism in children. And he based this claim on a study of just 12 children whose details were contained in this paper he wrote, published in the Lancet Medical Journal, describing these children, and claims that there was a link in time between the children receiving MMR and autism. Basically, what it was saying was that parents had turned up at this hospital, in fact, a bowel clinic, and spontaneously said, one after another over a period of about 6 months, that their child was developing perfectly normally, received an MMR vaccine, and within days was showing the first symptoms of autism. And that set off a huge public controversy in the UK, which then spread to the United States and is now spreading around the world. This idea that there's a link between vaccines and autism. And I investigated that proposition over many years, more years than I would care to count, because of the difficulties of finding out what's going on behind anonymized biomedical research.
So let's talk about Britain and how it was discovered that he falsified documents. And again, his research was just based on 12 children.
Well, I was just given a routine assignment at the absolute zenith of the what we call the MMR scare in the UK, when vaccination rates were at their lowest level since the vaccine had been introduced. And I was just asked to go and look at it and see what the position was, see if there was any stories in it to be done. And I began to unravel this whole thing. And the first thing I discovered, in a really over 3 stages, interspersed with lawsuits, the first stage was that these children who turned up at the hospital weren't just routine patients as they appeared to be. Their parents had brought their children to the hospital because Andrew Wakefield, this man who was running it, had been hired by a lawyer to make a case against the MMR vaccine. And these children were children of parents overwhelmingly who were members of, firstly, an anti-vaccine group, and they were clients of a lawyer. So I found that out, and we ran that on page one, and it set off this huge row in the UK because people just thought, well, so these allegations weren't just ordinary members of the public coming forward, but they were a group of people who'd been brought to the hospital in order to make the allegation, in order to put it in the paper, in order to create what ultimately happened was a class action lawsuit. So that was the first thing I discovered, and that set off a huge row. And the falling vaccination rates immediately began to recover from that time. This was in 2004, and the vaccination rate started to recover from then. And then I went on with further revelations about this particular project that were even more extraordinary.
But but I thought the his Andrew Wakefield, he was looking at Crohn's disease and he was connecting Crohn's disease to autism. Am I correct with that?
Yes, he was his original subject was Crohn's disease, and he'd hypothesized that measles virus was the cause of Crohn's disease. Nobody in that field today thinks that's true, but he thought that measles virus. He basically he'd gone to the hospital library and gone through an encyclopedia of viruses, and eventually came to one that sort of sounded to him as though, oh, that sounds a bit like about like measles causing Crohn's disease, and so he took up this hypothesis, which he's never backed away from, but nobody else supports
Agrees.
it. That
Yeah.
it causes Crohn's disease, which is anyone who doesn't know, Crohn's disease is not a very common disease, but it's very unpleasant. It strikes in the bowel and causes ulceration, and very often leads to surgery. Very unpleasant disease, not very common, and that was his field of interest. And this lawyer had seen that he'd been interested in measles virus, and they and went to him, approached him, and said, "Well, would you work for me?" And so he started this job on the side, being paid hourly rates to make a case that the MMR vaccine, which includes live measles virus, was the cause not just of Crohn's disease, but also now more importantly to them, autism.
Well, how did the lawsuit work out? Did they win the lawsuit? And
No, they lost. I mean, it was if you do the financial calculations, bringing it up to date today, you're talking about a lawsuit that consumed about $100,000. No, not $100,000. Hang on, it was how much was it? It would have been 26 million, $100 million. Sorry, one, such a long time. $100 million in today's money and conversions. Um, and it accomplished absolutely nothing. None of them won anything. The case collapsed when the lawyers for the representing the children told the court that they actually couldn't make the case that the vaccine caused autism.
so, it's interesting. So take us to how this get to the United States. And in my mind, the Netflix movie would start with Andrew Wakefield celebrating with Donald Trump in his first election of 2017 in a nice tuxedo, and he's there. How did he get from Great Britain to the United States, proposing the same connection with measles and the vaccination for measles and autism?
Well, he fled the United Kingdom as people started to get onto him. He was asked by the hospital where he worked and the university that ran the medical school to replicate his 12-child study with a lot more children and virological research, and he refused to do it. He said, "No, it's my academic freedom to decide what I do, and I'm not going to do it." And so they fired him. Well, they forced him out. And he fled to the United States and tried to continue the work there. Well, he did for a few years in Texas, where he set up a clinic where they were still trying to prove the same thing and failed again. Um, and then the United States had a similar lawsuit where enormous numbers of children were recruited, and in another lawsuit that failed in 2007. But he acquired the reputation of being very persuasive. He was British and went down very well on the autism circuit and the anti-vaccine circuit that was kind of around at the time. Became very popular and carried on doing the same thing in America.
So I think it's chapter 14 in your book, where you talk about there was a congressional hearing. How did that happen?
Well, it's interesting because the man who was just recently proposed to be heading the Centers for Disease Control, a man called Dave Weldon, was actually on this congressional committee where Wakefield turned up with an Irish pathologist who he was in partnership with. And this Irish pathologist said, yes, I can confirm that what Andrew Wakefield says is true, and I'm independent of him, and I've got nothing to gain by giving you wrong information. And what the committee didn't know was that the pair of them were business partners and were about to launch a company selling diagnostic kits and all kinds of other stuff off the back of the allegation that the MMR vaccine causes autism.
So today in this administration, the head of health and human services also agreed, I believe, but he changed a little bit. I'm not so sure where he is, that the vaccination may cause autism. You're aware of that, right?
Yes, I mean the Secretary for Health, Robert Kennedy, is a big admirer of Andrew Wakefield. They're quite close friends,
Oh, they
and
are.
Kennedy,
They are.
yes, yes, and
Oh,
Kennedy's said on a number of occasions that he believes that statues should be erected to Andrew Wakefield. No, they're very much in cahoots with each other. But the important thing is that the first stage, as I say, was the discovery of the investigation was the discovery that Wakefield was working for lawyers and the children had been brought there by people hoping to sue the manufacturers of the vaccines. The next stage was we discovered, oh, well, I discovered, I guess, I found that he'd actually registered a patent on his own vaccine. He'd called on parents at a press conference in London to boycott the MMR vaccine in favour of single measles shots. And he had 8 months before calling for that, he patented his own measles shot and was preparing with this Irish pathologist business plans to sell it through a network of companies that he'd set up.
well, what happened?
Um, well, I mean, it was crazy. I mean, it was one of those things that that could never have worked. I mean, I don't know if you know the Mel Brooks movie, The Producers. Do you know
Yes,
that one?
yes.
And the premise of The Producers is that you could make more money on a Broadway flop than you could on a successful Broadway musical,
Hmm.
because you'd raise a lot of money from mug punters. In Mel Brooks' case, it was little old ladies. And sell dozens of them, one third, one half shares in the company, keep the money, fold the production, and walk away laughing. Well, you can also do that in biotechnology, something very similar. If you've got enough buzz around a topic, mug punters will invest in it. So he was preparing to launch a company on the idea that we have discovered and we've got the patent on the cause of autism and Crohn's disease and what he called a complete cure for autism, a sort of all singing and dancing remedy for everything. And he was going to make his fortune on that. But unfortunately, that was when, at that point, he got fired by his employers. And they confronted him over all of this, and he disappeared to the United States. So that was the next stage of the investigation. And the final stage of the investigation was, if you like, that having been hired to find a link between MMR and autism, he actually failed to find one because the tests that were done on these 12 children didn't confirm anything to make you think that the vaccine caused autism. So what he then did was change the data. He changed their dates of birth. He changed
You mean
their
falsified the data?
he falsified. Yeah, he falsified their histories, what was wrong with them, what their medical conditions were, their histories, in order to create that appearance of the onset of autism symptoms very soon after the shot. So it was the most outright fraud. And eventually was fully established to have been a fraud in all sorts of ways, which I can't go into now, so it would take too long. But no question, this was one of the great science frauds of our time. Um, and nevertheless, he's still out there at it.
What lasting lesson should we take from this story?
Well, to me, the lasting lesson is not that this man did anything particularly extraordinary. What was extraordinary was he got caught. I think in science, there's a great deal of false information being published because medical journals, science journals, all the data is anonymized. You could never know who the patients were. How I got to know who the patients were and study their records is a huge, long story and involves a lot of litigation. He didn't do anything particularly unusual for a medical researcher. The mistake he made was doing it in a field as high profile as vaccines, because vaccines are of primary interest, principal interest, and very personal interest to enormous numbers of newspaper readers. So I could actually be resourced in just my first story took 4 months before we published anything at all. And I've been following this now and publishing dozens of stories on different aspects of it over the years that would never have been possible if he'd done the same thing. For example, just on Crohn's disease or all kinds of other medical conditions, even Alzheimer's. I think you'd have trouble getting that amount of support from a media organization as I did to investigate a subject. So the question I ask in the book really is, if he could do what he did, and I show you what he did, who else is doing what in the hospitals and laboratories that we may one day look to for our lives?
And that's what the lead to the next question. How can we trust our medical institutions? How can we trust them based on what you just said?
Well, that's a very good question. I'm quite skeptical about a lot of stuff that comes out. If something comes out that is so unusual and so left field that nobody has proposed it before, and it's not very carefully set up and evidenced with lots of, in this case, it would have been lots of children and lots of scientific tests and what have you, which in this case it wasn't. It is really very difficult, and we look to the medical establishment and the scientific community for guidance, but it always has to be with a certain amount of skepticism because we just don't know what's going on.
So, where do you know where Doctor, should I call him Doctor or Andrew Wakefield? Where is he now?
Well, he's not. It's an interesting point. He's not. He was struck off the medical register in the UK, so he can't practice medicine. So, really, he's not actually a doctor. Strangely enough, I mean, funnily enough, I'm a doctor in the sense I have a doctorate, but he doesn't have a doctorate. English doctors don't have doctorates. It's a graduate degree. It's a bachelor's degree that doctors have in the UK. Doctor is a courtesy title. So he's lost his courtesy title, and his research was all retracted. And so I don't call him doctor really. I think he's forfeited even the courtesy title.
So, do you know where he is now?
I believe, I'm not certain. The last I heard of him, he was in Florida, but he might have gone back to Texas. I really don't know because he's a bit vague as to whereabouts he is. He was in Texas, then he moved to Florida, and I'm not clear if he's moved back to Texas or he might actually be in Los Angeles because he's got involved in making videos, and I think he was there for a while. So I don't know where he is. I don't really want to know where he is for all kinds of reasons.
Understood. In my mind, the end of the book will have Andrew Wakefield with a famous model, because that's what you indicated in the book. Wasn't he
Elle
with?
Macpherson, yeah.
Yes, yes. And that's
Well,
where my Netflix movie would end.
well, I think that I always thought when I was writing this book that if anyone was going to read, if I was going to have one reader of The Doctor Who Fooled the World, it would be Elle Macpherson, because either her or her lawyers or her advisors, because she's going to have a whole group of public relations people and what have you. She might have got somebody else to read it. But very soon after the book appeared, she dumped him. And I think there may be some connection between the two, because obviously he would have told her that I'm a liar, I'm working for the drug industry, none of it's true, the dog ate his homework and all that stuff. And she would have read the book and thought, well, if this book is all fictional, if it's all made up, as Wakefield says, then he would have a lawsuit that would be the biggest lawsuit in the history of the English language. He'd be winning I don't know, hundreds of millions of dollars. But he threatened the book. His lawyer, it's a good story actually. His lawyer threatened the book with a 46-page complaint. Our lawyers told him where they could stick it, and his lawyer has been disbarred for stealing clients' money. So that only came out this week. So that fact. So, but yeah, he threatened the book. But if it had not been true, he would have won uh, colossal sums of money. You know,
Well,
he could retired forever. You know.
well, in my mind, this is again a Netflix movie. You've written it so well, even though it has a lot of scientific information, it is it's a good read. And like a friend of mine said, his name is Bill, you cannot make this up.
Mm.
It is so it's so fantastically unreal that it's hard to make it up, that it's real. So everyone, HWRE Lifestyle Family, this is a must read. And you need to rethink about vaccination, especially in this period of time when measles is spreading in the United States. We thank you. We thank you for this interview. Can we circle back later with you for another interview?
Sure, sure.
Thank you so much. Come
My
on.
pleasure. Have a good
Okay.
day.